Yeah, why don't you just... Good morning, everybody. I think we've got our choreography organized. Welcome, everybody. My name is Nancy Lindborg. I'm the president here at the United States Institute of Peace, and I'm delighted to welcome everybody here for the launch of USIP Senior Study Group Report on China's Role in Myanmar's Internal Conflicts. And I'm especially delighted to welcome two very dear friends and partners, Dan Twining, who's the president of the International Republican Institute, and Ambassador Derek Mitchell, who, when this study began, he was our senior advisor for Burma, but he is now, as of just last week, I think, 2 weeks, taken up his position as the head of the National Democratic Institute. So, Derek, big congratulations on your new role. We, of course, miss you here. And how appropriate is it that we now have as the two chairs of this study, the presidents, respectively, of IRI and NDI, the day after Democracy Day to talk about this. So we couldn't have planned it better. We're just delighted. I'd like to also give a special warm welcome to Professor David Steinberg, a very distinguished expert on Burmese history and politics, who helped us really put this discussion into historical context. And I'd like to acknowledge and welcome Ambassador Oong Ling from the Burmese Embassy. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for joining us for this very important conversation. And we have with us here in the front row the very distinguished members of the study group. So thank you, everybody, for your contributions and for joining us here for the launch of the report. I think, as most people know, USIP was founded by Congress in 1984 as an independent, nonpartisan national institution dedicated to reducing and resolving violent international conflicts. And we believe very much that a world without violent conflict is very possible, that it's fundamentally a practical endeavor, and of course it's essential for our collective security. And so we pursue this mission by working around the world with partners, providing tools, education, resource, but we also very much use this global headquarters building to convene these kinds of conversations, bringing people together from different views and perspectives to try to solve difficult problems. And that is exactly what today's discussion is meant to do. The China-Burma Senior Study Group's report, China's Role in Myanmar's Internal Conflicts, is an extremely relevant and timely topic. We are seeing China becoming increasingly engaged in and active in Burma's conflicts, in particular in Rakhine State, in Kachin and Shan states. And we're seeing China take an active role in hosting various meetings in Burma around some of the particular conflicts. And this really reflects a trend that has been growing over the past decade. We're seeing China flex more and more of its muscle internationally, investing heavily in countries across Africa and Asia, playing a more active role in both regional and international conflicts. So this is the focus of a major line of effort here at USIP to help understand better China's role in conflict and competition, how it affects what we may do or should do. And starting this year, USIP has convened a series of bipartisan study groups, senior study groups, to examine China's influence in conflict dynamics around the world. So the China-Burma Senior Study Group is the first in this series. Last week, I had the privilege of joining the first meeting of the second senior study group, which is focused on China's role in negotiations with North Korea. And I would note that in addition to the work with our senior study groups, USIP has also convened a bipartisan task force at the request of Congress, which is composed of eminent former officials, renowned policy experts, with the task of suggesting new approaches to preventing and addressing the underlying causes of extremism in fragile states with a focus on the Horn, the Sahel, and the Middle East. These are regions where China is also playing a prominent role. And the task force just last Monday released an interim findings report that probes these questions of how to address the underlying causes of extremism, but also how to understand and adapt to China's growing influence in fragile states. So I'm delighted to today that we're able to continue these efforts. Delighted to be able to welcome everybody here today to this important conversation. And before I turn things over to get the conversation underway, I'd like to encourage everybody who's joining us today, including those watching online, to participate in today's conversation using the hashtag USIP China SSG. Hashtag USIP China SSG. Follow us on Twitter at USIP. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce Jennifer Statz, who's the director of USIP's East and Southeast Asia programs and director of the China Senior Study Group series. With that, please join me in welcoming Jennifer.
Well, thank you, Nancy, and thank you to all of you for joining us here today for the launch of this report. Now, as Nancy mentioned, this report is the first in a new series of USIP reports in which we will convene small, bipartisan groups of senior experts to look at China's role or influence on conflict dynamics around the world. This first group, of course, was focused on China's role in Myanmar's internal conflicts, and as Nancy mentioned, we'll start looking at other conflicts in the subsequent groups. And the goal of these groups is really to offer new insights into China's objectives and role vis-a-vis these various conflicts, and to generate new recommendations for ways that the U.S. government and other key stakeholders may account for China's impact in their work to prevent and resolve conflict and support lasting peace. Before we dive into the substance of the report and its findings, I want to take just a minute to introduce the co-chairs and the members of the study group. As Nancy mentioned, we've been incredibly lucky to have two tremendous co-chairs with Dan Twining and Derek Mitchell. Dan, of course, is the president of IRI. Before joining IRI, he served as counselor and director of the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States here in Washington, and also served as a member of the U.S. Secretary of State's policy planning staff, as a foreign policy advisor to U.S. Senator John McCain, and as a staff member on the to the U.S. Trade Representative. Derek Mitchell, of course, is the president of NDI, having recently served as the U.S. ambassador to Myanmar, where he was America's first ambassador to the country in 22 years. He's also held many distinguished positions at the Department of State and Department of Defense, as well as serving as a senior fellow at CSIS, a senior advisor at the Albright Stonebridge Group, and most importantly, a senior advisor here at USIP. We really could not have asked for better leaders for this project. Dan and Derek have been incredible. They both bring really deep expertise and extensive experience in this region, and they brought together a terrific group of experts to really explore these issues in detail and craft this final report. Several members of the study group are with us here today in the front row. Several others couldn't be with us, but are obviously here through the substance of the report. And the members of that group include Jonah Blank from the RAND Corporation, Priscilla Clapp from USIP, Christina Fink from George Washington University, Carla Freeman from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, Murray Hebert from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Satu Lemay from the East-West Center, Michael Schiffer from the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, David Shambaugh from George Washington University, David Steinberg from Georgetown University, who we'll hear from shortly, Jonathan Stivers from the U.S. Economic and Security Review Commission, and Jonathan Stromsath from the Brookings Institution. And finally, before we get any further, I want to stop to thank and acknowledge two of my colleagues here at USIP who have really been instrumental in pulling this all together, Jennifer Chang and Rachel Vandenbrink, who have been working incredibly hard over the last 9 months to keep this project on track and really make sure this report was as strong and as accurate as it could possibly be. So we're very grateful for all the work that they have put in. And we will hear from Derek and Dan about the substance of the report here in just a minute, but before we do, we would like to set the stage with a brief overview of the history of China-Myanmar relations from one of the leading experts on the topic, Dr. Steinberg. Most of you probably know him, but for those who don't, he is Distinguished Professor of Asian Studies Emeritus at Georgetown University, and he has had a diverse and impressive career that spans academia, work in NGOs, and senior positions in government. We opened our very first SSG meeting with a presentation from Dr. Steinberg on the history of China-Myanmar relations, and we wanted to start today's session that way as well. So Dr. Steinberg, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ambassador, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to be here, and I'm glad not to talk about the report because other people more competent will do that, but I will give you an idiosyncratic view of China-Myanmar relations, which are intimately involved with the U.S. as well. I will read most of my report, my comments, unfortunately, because otherwise I would tend to go on forever. My style is not lapidary, as they say, so I apologize for the length. The varying intensity of Sino-Burmese relations has been intimately connected with the U.S.-Myanmar relations. These relations have as the leitmotif the status of many of the various ethnic minority groups who comprise about 1/3 of the population of the state. Some have assorted weaponry and insular aspirations. Many of these ethnic groups along the ethnically irrational China frontier affect relations involving all the three international states, for the same groups straddle the border. Thus, it is most appropriate for the USIP to consider this important complex conjunction of conflict and potential development. Our beginning text today is from a close associate of Chairman Mao. Chen Yi, in 1956, wrote a poem. I'll read from that poem just for a moment. It's called For Friends in Burma. I live by the river's head, you live by its tail. Limitlessly, we love each other. We drink the same river's water. I drink from the upper flows, you drink from below. Endlessly the river flows, we share everlasting happiness. We are neighbors, our friendships last. Anti-imperialism begets freedom, we are peacefully united. We are Pugpaw, siblings. Our languages are connected. We are united and help each other. Peace is powerful. Living by the river, we praise its breath. Climbing mountains, we sing of the majesty. The mountains face north. The river flows south. In a classical Chinese balanced parallel line, the poem creates myths and illusions that continue to influence policy. Pugpaw, meaning siblings born from the same womb, is a term continuously used to describe a desired but not actual relationship. Fear and concern are more realistic appraisals. But as China has public illusions about relationships, so has the United States, Japan, India, the Myanmar government, and each of the various ethnic groups in that state. Their interactions are in large part the story of Burma and Myanmar. The single most important and critical factor in Burmese foreign policy since independence in 1948 has been neutralism in the Cold War and balance thereafter. In 1961, U Thant became Secretary General of the United Nations, not because he was internationally known, but because Burma was the quintessentially neutral country on which East and West could agree. He was, after all, a rather minor official, ambassador to the UN, and he got that job because he happened to be UNU's secretary before. If the single most important foreign policy of Myanmar has been balanced, the most important internal policy issue are the relations between majority and minority ethnic groups, a problem unresolved by all Burmese governments, civilian or military. This attempted foreign policy balance or equilibrium as a basic tenet is like a calm sea, but with waves and tides. Myanmar-Burma has seen undulating waves or tides of foreign influence, the waxing and waning of Chinese and Western, especially U.S. impact. Each has influenced the other. But the Burmese have been very pragmatic. They live in a dangerous and important neighborhood and need good relations with their far larger and more powerful neighbors. As UNU once said, Burma is a tender gourd among the cactus. Excuse me. Burma was early important to the PRC because for some years it was the only non-communist contiguous state that recognized China and was the portal for Chinese traveling abroad or visitors to Beijing. Shortly after independence, the pro-Chinese and fear of China Pakpa period was in part a product of U.S. unadmitted clandestine military support for retreating Chinese national Kuomintang troops that sought refuge in northern Burma and resulted in the Burmese expelling the U.S. aid program for a period. China was always suspicious of Ne Win's socialism after 1962, and Chinese influence faltered with the Cultural Revolution explosion into Burma in 1967, resulting in dozens of deaths, occupation of the Chinese embassy, and withdrawal of ambassadors for some months. Even though the Chinese and Burmese had resolved three critical issues facing the Burma state, the citizenship of Chinese residents, the Kuomintang problem, and the border dispute, which was a clear Burmese victory, UNU and Zhou Enlai were quite close. It was not until 1988-1989 period, with the disintegration of the Burma Communist Party along the Yunnan frontier, that relations improved. China supported that party, claiming party-to-party relations were different from state-to-state ones. This opened the, quote, ports of Yunnan province to overland trade, both legal and illegal, and the influx of massive illegal Chinese immigration into Myanmar for economic advantage, causing considerable Burmese resentment. This was approximately the same time as the 1988 failed People's Revolution and its brutal suppression by the military. The suppression of 1988 and the coup that followed, and the imposition of direct oppressive military junta rule resulted in the U.S. withdrawal and the closure of the economic aid program, the cessation of military training and anti-narcotics programs, and after 1990 and the unrecognized election defeat of the military, the attempted isolation of Burma, Myanmar by the U.S., whose policy was regime change and the recognition of the National League for Democracy and Aung San Suu Kyi, in fact, government. She effectively made U.S. policy toward that country. Ironically, as the U.S. tried to cut Myanmar off from the world with various imposed sanctions, Myanmar was, albeit ineptly, trying to open at least in part, having titularly abandoned socialism in 1988 and had proclaimed the first foreign investment law and encouraged tourism. China took advantage of the West's retrenchment, and a strong Chinese tide ensued. Military equipment, training, and aid poured in. Close relations developed to a degree that the Burmese themselves felt the international equilibrium needed to be restored to maintain balance. The Chinese tide was running too high. As the new Burmese constitution of 2008 was approved in a manipulated referendum and equally corrupt elections followed in 2010, the Burmese and what has been called a quasi-civilian government moved to correct this balance. Quiet signals and negotiations with the U.S. followed, with the release of political prisoners and considerable liberalizations. China was still important, and the first foreign visit in May 2011 by the newly installed President Thein Sein, a former general and prime minister, was to Beijing, where he signed the first ever comprehensive strategic cooperative partnership with China. To the chagrin of the Chinese, however, he suspended the Chinese construction of the Myitsone Dam in September, the Chinese claiming that this was because of Burmese civil society complaints fostered by the U.S. The tide changed, and the Chinese felt the rise of U.S. and Western influence, and they began to search for who lost Myanmar and diversified its diplomatic engagement with Myanmar. That wave continued with the election of the Aung San Suu Kyi government in 2015 and Chinese efforts to reach out beyond the military to the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi herself, where that Pakpor relationship was again invoked on her trips to Beijing. Now the tide has once again shifted. The strong Western U.S.-UN denunciations of the treatment of the Rohingya Muslim population, a group broadly vilified by the Burmese as Bengali and thus foreign, resulted in ethnic cleansing and charges of even possible genocide. It has led again to the rise of Chinese influence in Beijing, backed by the Burmese military position. The Chinese are especially sensitive to any Muslim issue because of their concern of the Muslim Uyghur unrest in Xinjiang. But the vehemence and extent of Burmese antipathy to the Rohingya is difficult for foreigners to comprehend. Central to the interplay of Chinese and U.S. interests in Burma and Myanmar has been the treatment and position of the many ethnic minorities, and the best armed of whom are on or near the China border. Majority Burman and minority relations have been the central issue facing the nation since independence, and no government has resolved some fair, mutually agreeable in some Burmese sense, distribution of power and resources between and among the majority Burmans and the ethnic groups, some of which are armed and whose forces number some estimated 50,000 troops. The China-Myanmar border is ethnically porous, with major populations of minority people straddling the frontier, leading to unrest and extra-legal activities of both an economic and a security nature, with officials from all sides illegally benefiting from such activities. Yunnan province itself sometimes appears to have less than consistent policies with Beijing, although the nature of any inconsistencies is subject to deliberation. Sino-Burman interests along their mutual periphery claim to be complementary. The Myanmar military demand a unified state, and finally even admitting it may be of a federal nature. China wants a stable border, no refugees, public and private business opportunities, and no Americans along the frontier. A stable border for China means more access to Myanmar economically, which is very important to Yunnan province, and more strategically access to the Bay of Bengal and the Indian Ocean. China views the U.S. enhanced role, claiming coordination with Japan's investments in aid, as encirclement or containment of China in an area that has been traditionally regarded as its sphere of interest. To the Chinese, this is the second containment policy following the Cold War and the SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization era. The U.S. pushes for democracy and human rights, and its pivot to the region, or the Indo-Pacific region as we call it today. The various ethnic groups, some of whom are essentially Christian, seek support and lobby the U.S., anathema to both Myanmar and China, and want some form of federalism on which they cannot agree and which the military and civilian Burmans have not yet approved beyond a vague concept. Suspicions and mistrust abound between states and among groups and leaders. All feel vulnerable, though some of these fears are as yet illusions. Fear of a small Muslim minority of some 4%, overwhelming an 88% Buddhist population. There is no likely early solution to these multiple and interconnected dilemmas. If China had an illusion of some form of quiet hegemony over Myanmar in the Pakpor relationship, the U.S. had an illusion of instant democracy under an Aung San Suu Kyi civilian government. The Myanmar military has had the illusion that arms would solve the minority issues. Its subservient civilian leadership, that denial would assuage foreign critics of the Rohingya debacle. The ethnic groups, sometimes creating mythic pasts, cannot agree on a united front for their aspirations. Japan and India may believe their assistance will mitigate China's role, but that is likely to be an illusion as well. The peoples of the country suffer. The tensions remain. Illusions continue. And changing policies is difficult. For as Arthur Koestler once wrote, nothing is more sad than the death of an illusion. And I leave you there and we listen to the discussion now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Steinberg. I fear we gave you the nearly impossible task of covering a very long history and very complex relationship in just 10 minutes, but you still managed to do a wonderful job hitting the high points and the main points that I think are really useful for framing the discussion today. So thank you very much for doing that. And I'll now turn it over to our co-chairs to provide an overview of the report and its findings and recommendations.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jennifer, and thank you all. And when I was ambassador, I used to open with Alo Minglabakamya. So with the ambassador here, Mr. Ambassador, friends from the embassy, and anyone else who speaks Burmese, Myanmar, welcome and thank you for coming out. First of all, I want to say thank you to David Steinberg for, as usual, a very thoughtful and thought-provoking meditation on not just China-Myanmar relations, but Myanmar's thinking generally. And I think his point about illusions is extremely well taken. I think everything that we should be doing in foreign policy, international relations, and certainly when it comes to countries in Asia and elsewhere, we have to get past illusions. I used to say in my embassy that facts without context is not truth, and which is why I was very interested to have Professor Steinberg here provide that historical context so that we can get an understanding not just of the facts of the current moment, but the context in which we are talking, and then we can get at the full truth and try not to move out based on illusion, or we can debate what the illusions are, but illusions that are not unaddressed certainly tend to metastasize and cause problems. So thank you for that as an introduction. I did leave here about 2 weeks ago to be part of NDI, be president of NDI. And so it gives me an opportunity to say publicly a few things that I wish I was able to say better privately and publicly, which is a few thank yous, which are relevant for this report. First of all, I want to thank Nancy Lindberg for her leadership of USIP, what a tremendous institution this is, and what tremendous leadership that she provides to this place. It was an honor for me to be associated. Andrew Wilder, Jennifer Statz for her great leadership of the China and now Asia program. Kay Spencer, who's over here, who's a great partner in all things, and particularly the two who are most involved in this project. I mentioned earlier, Rachel Vandenbrink in back, and Jennifer Chang, who was here. I don't know if she's still here. She walked out a moment ago. But anyway, they were absolutely central to putting this thing together and doing the research and writing, and I just want to make sure they get their due in public. So thank you all for great work. I also want to thank the senior study group members here in front, not all of whom are here, but everyone who was out there. I asked Dan Twining to do this as a co-chair when I knew him as a great partner in the think tank world. As an Asianist, I'm an Asianist. That would be great to have him involved. Yeah, okay, he's NDI chair, but no one here is operating based on their formal titles. I'm not here as NDI, he's not here as IRI. But it's funny when we get the report out, it's NDI and IRI who are releasing this thing. We are here as individuals, we are not here as institutions. But it is a real pleasure to be a partner and have a one little bipartisan cell in this town and in this country.
It's us.
Well, it's us. And we want to take whatever NDI and IRI can do together as friends, as believing things that are beyond partisanship. It starts with this report, and it will continue on in the realm of democracy and U.S. foreign policy from here on. But I want to give him a chance to say a few words first. I'll talk a little bit more about the substance of the report and some of the terms of reference of the report. But he was an outstanding co-chair, and thank you for that. And let me just turn to you, Dan, for some thoughts.
Thanks, Derek. So I would also just like to add my thanks. It's really an excellent team here at USIP, including both Jennifer's and Rachel and the whole team. What one learns really quickly in co-chairing a study group is that having an expert staff to actually produce the report and make sure we got it right is at the center. So thank you. I'd also just like to thank the study group members. You know, the great benefit to me, other than working with Derek and the great team at USIP, was getting together every month to listen to our real experts, our senior study group members, just elucidate the complexities around China-Myanmar relations. It was sort of like being back in graduate school, and I'm sorry it's over, because I'm ready to keep coming to class. I also think we were lucky. USIP is also planning similar studies around Pakistan, North Korea, several other, difficult conflicts with big national security implications for the United States. And I think we got lucky with Myanmar, just given the extraordinary story of that country's opening, given the extraordinary potential of that country to change the future of its population and also the entire region, right? So I think we'd say we are still optimists. I'd also, again, just like to thank USIP. Really, I think there is a core national interest in the United States in understanding difficult conflicts and the conundrums they present for American policy. And you're not going to find this in journalism. You may find it in academia, but it will be much harder to read. And I think they've done a public service for the United States in producing these sort of studies that really, I think, help our policymakers to act wisely. And we can make a long list going back several centuries of conflicts that the U.S. has gotten involved in or engaged in or not gotten involved in, where perhaps we didn't have such expertise behind our officials. So I'm not going to tell you anything about Myanmar you don't know, sitting between these gentlemen. I would like to just kind of broaden the frame a little bit and give you an outline of some of the wider implications that we discussed. And then Derek, I think, is going to talk you more specifically through many of our findings. So I'll go broad and he'll go deep. But really, first observation, China is a central internal player in the Myanmar conflicts. I think sometimes we think there's domestic policy or domestic politics and there's foreign policy, right? And in Myanmar, it's harder to make that case given China's central role, given its relationships with the different ethnic groups, given its singular position in the country, which is a factor not only of geography, but of long historical cultural connectivities that span so many dimensions. So Myanmar decision makers are factoring in the role and interests of China, for better or worse, when they are making domestic political decisions around the conflicts. And I think that's true of China more than of any other external actor, for sure. That's point one. Point two is just not to do a broad historical sweep, but really just to think about the last 7 years and how far we have come. My narrative around Myanmar is that it began to open in this 2010-2011 period to the world, partly as a result of the then military government's anxiety around the fact that the tide had gotten too high, right, to use that metaphor, around China's influence in Myanmar. And you saw this dramatic rejection of the Myitsone Dam project, which China had been leading, and then this very historic opening to the world that Derek Mitchell was such a central part of, along with many others here, right? But this is not a linear story, because here we are in 2018, and there is one country that is protecting Myanmar and its government more than any other from diplomatic and other forms of international pressure arising particularly from the Rohingya conflict. And that country that is doing so is China. And so just in the last 7 years, 8 years, you have seen kind of a waxing and waning, a rise and fall and rise of Chinese influence in Myanmar around these conflicts, and particularly today around the crisis in Rakhine, that I think we should really spend some time thinking about and talking about. Point three is really to, just for a minute, kind of explore the strategic consequences of China's very intensive engagement in Myanmar. Again, there's a big part of this that is a domestic political story and is a driving factor in the negotiations with different groups within Myanmar about the future constellation of peace and security in that country. But there is also a wider story of China pushing through Myanmar, through vast infrastructure and other forms of projects into the Bay of Bengal and the Indian Ocean. And the fact that this could transform the fate of the Indo-Pacific, right? This is not simply a story of Myanmar, but this study looking at China's role in the Myanmar conflicts is a fascinating case study of China's use of different forms of influence in order to perhaps achieve broader strategic and security objectives. I would love to, again, come back to that in the discussion, but I think we have to understand that this is really not simply a report about China and Myanmar. If you ask Indians, they see a very central interest for them in what is happening in this relationship. If you ask Japanese, if you ask other Asians, they are acutely aware of the strategic implications of an expanded Chinese presence in Myanmar. Fourth, I'm getting towards the end here, we both run democracy organizations that work out in the world in more than 100 countries to help people govern themselves freely and justly, right? There are consequences for the Myanmar people of China's footprint and influence in their country and in its relationship with both the civilian side of the government in Naypyidaw as well as the military leadership and its enduring influence. I would argue that to truly solve the conflicts, the internal conflicts in Myanmar, really what you need are broad and inclusive institutions. You need transparent and accountable and open politics. You need very robust rule of law, free media, all the civic factors that could help this country, civic and political factors that could help this country unite around a plan for peace internally, right? You don't necessarily have that today. You have something quite different. I would like to just mention in this context one key finding of our study, which is on page 7, which is that genuine peace in Myanmar risks China's strategic position in that country. Continued friction between central authorities and border populations provides Beijing a major source of influence over Naypyidaw, right? So on the one hand, China will play a central role in the peace constellation in Myanmar. On the other hand, a true peace that unified the country internally, that brought peace to the whole country, possibly could diminish China's position and influence there. And that's sort of a profound insight. Finally, and I will stop just with the sentence, that Myanmar is a fascinating case study as we think about China's role in the world, as China moves out as a global actor. Obviously, there's a lot of interest in what China's influence in Africa and Latin America, in the Middle East, in the West, in Europe. But really, its neighbors are a very good test of what kind of power China will be in the 21st century. And so again, I think I see this study not simply about China and its role in the Myanmar conflicts, but really about what kind of world the Chinese system wants to shape, and particularly what kind of Asia the Chinese system wants to shape. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Very, very important big picture thinking on this and outstanding analysis of what we've done and what is happening in Asia with China. So let me get to some of the issues with the report, but let me start with one broad point as well, kind of a caveat. In this town now, or just anywhere, anything related to China that the U.S. does is inevitably viewed in great power competition terms. So if we have a report on China's involvement in conflicts, and people are going to say, oh yeah, the United States has an ulterior motive and there's an agenda here. And I think there are some in Myanmar that may feel that. China feels that sometimes. And I'm particularly sensitive not so much to China, but to the Myanmar people, the Myanmar context. They don't want to be part of any great power competition. They don't want to have other great powers think about things over their head. And I don't want this report to be viewed that way. I don't want to sense that this is the United States thinking about China involved, and therefore we have to be engaged in some way, in a great power way, either in competition or even cooperation over the heads of the people of Myanmar. This is about understanding. This is about our understanding what is China doing as part of a whole series that USIP is about around the world and affecting peace. U.S. Institute of Peace is about how do you mitigate conflict? How do you deal with conflict situations? China is more and more engaged in the world. They're having more and more impact, no more so than on their borders. So in order for us to understand how we can engage ourselves to mitigate conflict, we need to know how other major powers are doing so, and China is a major power doing so. So I don't want this to be viewed as somehow the U.S. working over the heads of a small country and thinking on their terms. So I'm a little bit sensitive to that point, having lived in Myanmar, and knowing that if I ever mention the word China, they think, aha, U.S. and China. It's all about the U.S. and China. This is really about how do we understand and help Myanmar get to a place of peace by understanding the roles of all the major players. And then we have to do no harm in engaging in that context. Now, how we conducted this, we had both a lot of Myanmar sources that were in town or that we had Skypes with or did phone calls with, Chinese sources, both written and personal. What we came to are observations based on both my own personal observation, other personal observations of Americans, but firsthand accounts of Myanmar and Chinese sources themselves. And we drew up a list of questions, terms of reference to think about. What are China's historic interests in the country? The internal decision-making processes inside China, the differences in interest among stakeholders in China, what activities contribute to conflict or mitigate conflict that China is engaging in, and where there might be areas of cooperation, and where there might be areas of competition, how do we mitigate those areas of competition, again, in the interest of promoting peace inside the country. And so we go through some of the findings of the report. We had a whole section on China's interests in the country. I think, to a great extent, David Steinberg listed them already very quickly, very well. So I won't go through those too much more than I need to. But there are four primary interests that David mentioned that are important. Number one, Chinese interest, stability along their very porous border. That means refugee flows, it means drug flows, it means illicit activities. It means sometimes bombs, wayward bombs would fall on Chinese territory. They have a great interest that there be stability along a very vulnerable border, 1,300-kilometer border that China has with Myanmar. Very practical issue when it comes to their desire to mitigate, limit conflict in Myanmar. Two, as mentioned, access to the Indian Ocean. I think it was my friend Tham Minh who talked about Myanmar as being the west coast of China, potentially the west coast. That China doesn't have a west coast. They have a southwest area that should be developed, but access to the Indian Ocean, pipelines, road and rail links, very important for strategic reasons, potentially naval access, though those are questioned whether that can be done. Certainly no basing can be done in Myanmar according to the Myanmar Constitution. But China would like to get more access to the Indian Ocean, and that runs through Myanmar. Third is those broader economic interests. A lot of it, again, Yunnan, 25% of its trade is done with Myanmar. And it will run in the Shan and Kachin states, and those are the very high conflict areas. So broader economic interests, illicit and illicit infrastructure development, very important to China's interests. And then the issue of geostrategy, limiting American, Western, and U.S. influence in the country was very obvious when I was there. It was actually explicit at one point when the Chinese ambassador said to me, one of the three that was there, to choose which one it was, I won't say publicly, but he said, we don't want you to go to Kachin State or Shan State. So you have to respect our interest, which was an interesting, and I'll get to some of the observations we had based on those types of, that kind of rhetoric, that kind of conversation. But they clearly felt threatened by the United States, kind of zero-sum mentality, if I may say, about U.S. involvement in Myanmar. So they didn't want us near a porous border, anywhere near their border. And I think that can have an effect on peace because some of the ethnic groups have long-standing relationships with the West. They desire to have a little bit of backup. They feel vulnerable to the center. They may feel more confident making concessions if they felt they had the international community behind them. So China's zero-sum mentality in this case can actually potentially constrain peace. Again, this is up to the people of Myanmar to decide what is the right constellation for peace. They'll make their own decisions. But I know for a fact that some of the decisions during my time were made against their own interest because China didn't like it. China didn't like something didn't happen. And that, I think, to me, that certainly crosses a line. And I think it's to China's mentality, which is unfortunate. We should be thinking about what's best for Myanmar, Myanmar's peace, which is so essential and so needed for that country. So let me give you a sense of observations and recommendations in there very quickly, and then we'll get to questions and comments. First one, it gets to this question I just raised, or this issue I just raised of China being engaged very directly on some of these key issues of peace and war. China has set aside, in Myanmar it seems, its non-interference policy, almost explicitly. And one can observe that maybe elsewhere in the world, just as they're setting aside hide and bide, those who do China policy, maybe they're setting aside non-interference more and more because of their global interests, strategic interests, and their basically tangible interests. They have personnel in countries and very intense reason to be involved in others' internal affairs. And this is a case where they have been very much involved in Rakhine State and in the peace process. They've offered to mediate peace. They've forced the ethnic armed organizations, for better or worse, to the negotiating table. And they've kept the U.S. out and kept others in the West out. So that non-interference policy that China has promoted for so long has certainly been set aside in Myanmar, and we should watch elsewhere. Again, as Dan said, maybe a indication of a broader, kind of a test of a broader change in China's approach to the world. Secondly, though, Myanmar does view, all in all, we found in our discussions, Myanmar does view China as constructive in its approach. That Naypyidaw has seen China's involvement as helpful, in part in getting ethnic armed organizations in and involving them. It's not as if they're twisting arms in a completely negative way. I think the ethnic armed organizations have no choice to go along with it. They may not like it at every point, but in talking to them, they say, well, they haven't been really obstructive so much. They've been overall, constructive so far, but they'll have to watch to see where that leads. But there is, as a third point, there are, I think, widespread questions about China's motives, whether they truly are interested have the same interests that the people of Myanmar have. And as Dan said, and as we say in the report, and many have said this, that the suspicion is that China has neither an interest in hot war, which, as we say, can flow across the border, nor a complete peace, because that can reduce their leverage with Naypyidaw, with ethnic armed organizations along the border, and such. So I think you have to watch. They do want a kind of peace, but whether it's a complete peace and whether it serves their interest, and whether they will end up obstructing, who knows? But that suspicion is certainly there. Whether China has the same interests going forward, and there's a history there. The people of Myanmar remember China, and they have a long history, a long border. They won't forget that. And frankly, I think they have that view of all great powers. They might be suspicious of the United States as well, or anyone involved in their affairs. But with a border as they do with China, those suspicions are quite front and center. Fourth, China has shown very little interest in coordinating their efforts inside the country on peace or on anything, Rakhine State, anything like that. We had coordinating mechanisms on the ground. The UN, Norway, EU, the United States, others, we all had tried to coordinate so we were working together and didn't duplicate efforts. And so Naypyidaw can see an international, all in one room, the internationals, and we can work with them in that coordinated fashion, help the government think about us as a group. China would never be involved in that. They always work separately, which I think has never been very helpful. And we'll get to that later in terms of recommendations. Fifth, the Rohingya crisis, I think, enabled, as Dan said, enabled China to recover its primacy among the various international players in Myanmar. It's played a role in covering for what's gone on there. I think they do that in large part because of their substantial political and economic interest in the country, and certainly in Rakhine State. Though even as the investment in Myanmar has declined, Chinese investment, they still have, I think, gotten back in the game in a way because the West is viewed very poorly now over the Rohingya issue. Sixth, China has strengthened its central control and direction of policy. There was always a local central dynamic. Yunnan has driven policy. Locals have driven policy. The central government has seen that as unhelpful and seen detriments to that approach. So they have strengthened their central control over the Yunnan authorities. But at the same time, private actors have continued to play a role cross-border, engaging in illicit activity. Very tough, I think, to control that, but China has not controlled that very effectively. And it has both underwritten the conflict. They play all sides. They buy the resources. They give money to illicit actors from the military, from local governments, as well as the ethnic armed groups. but that's what happens in conflict. You have that type of illicit activity. In China, private actors are playing a very strong role in that, which is going to be a constraint on a complete peace. And finally, the ultimate issue, which is, I think, again, what Dr. Steinberg talked about. Myanmar is a small country among great powers. It's their history, it's their geography, it's their mindset, their vulnerability to great powers, whether the United States or Great Britain or whoever. And they will seek an over-reliance on any one of them, whether it's China or the United States or others. They need options, and they need to balance us off each other to some degree. So there may be a little bit of a constraint on the extent of Chinese influence, at least constitutionally inside Myanmar, at least their instincts. And there's certainly various questions about the way the Chinese do business. And I think is what Dan was talking about, is what kind of country does Myanmar want to be? How does it want to develop? And you certainly hear they don't want to develop according to Chinese norms, the way Chinese do business in places, whether it's labor norms or debt trap norms, predatory lending. All these things are certainly present in Myanmar, and I think it behooves the international community to demonstrate an alternative vision, a way that actually empowers the people of Myanmar to make decisions in their own interest, both personally and for their country going forward. So ultimately, there might be some constraints on China, but an over-reliance on China, but we'll have to see how that goes going forward. Very quickly, recommendations, which are just a few, and they extend from these observations. First is that China should open it up itself to international cooperation, should be involved in the coordinating mechanisms. If they truly want to demonstrate they're interested as much in Myanmar's interests as their own, and that they make it easier for us to all coordinate and not have the zero-sum mentality that just because the West are involved or the U.S. is involved, that it comes at their expense. We should take the great power competition out of Myanmar and just focus on how do we help stability. We have a lot of common interests there. Help this place achieve what has been unachievable since independence, which is peace and stability and development. And I don't think any of us should be involved in making that very complicated problem more complicated. And if I may be very frank, I think China had done that, certainly during my time there. We all have, I think, an ability, and we should try to contribute to peace as comfortable to the people of Myanmar. Secondly, we have to be more, I think they should be more transparent in their activities. It's kind of a corollary to that. Not very transparent about things. That will help in this process. Number three gets to this issue of the norms. Corporate social responsibility, you hear that term from the Chinese. They are perhaps learning on this. They did renegotiate the Chakbu port, I think in a way that was more comfortable to Myanmar. But taking local concerns into account will also help peace. The way business is being done in some of these conflict areas will tell the ethnic armed groups whether there will be a peace dividend or peace means they will be victimized once more. This will be just open season for folks to roll in there, take advantage economically, and that can be a constraint to ethnic groups taking this very difficult step. So China can help with that if they are truly transparent and responsible, and we as well, everybody, the United States, everybody, be affirm corporate social responsibility principles in partnership. And finally, when it comes to Rakhine State, the Rohingya issue, which is dominating all of our thinking, for good reason, certainly that it dominates because it is such an awful, awful tragedy. China should join in assisting Myanmar and the UN to implement the Annan Commission recommendations. They're accepted by the government in Myanmar. They're accepted by us. They're very difficult to implement. They need to be implemented urgently. I think China should be putting itself strongly, publicly, with the international community and Myanmar government of figuring out a way to, in a timely fashion, implement those guidelines, which get to all the issues of citizenship, of dignity, of livelihoods, of freedom of movement, health, all the things that every person deserves, and certainly the Rohingya and the Rakhine people deserve in spades. And we would welcome China's involvement in that going forward. So that is the report in a nutshell. I think the report in some ways goes deeper on certain issues. We have very nice maps, a lot of data, makes it understandable. And again, I credit Jennifer and her team and Rachel and the other Jennifer for their help on that. But we welcome further conversation and discussion on this and hope, again, what USIP wanted to do when I was here and is continuing is to get deeper understanding of these very complex issues in the Washington context so we can have an ongoing conversation and make policy based on facts and not illusion. So thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Derek and Dan, both for your very helpful comments to help frame this today. We will open the floor for questions and answers from the audience, but before we do that, I want to give the members of the senior study group a chance to say something. If anyone has additional comments they'd like to make, the floor is open and would welcome your additional thoughts at this time. Do you want to? Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Well, thank you for the opportunity to say a few words today, and thank you to Derek and Dan for shepherding your leadership of putting this report together, and really for your voices for democracy, which are so important right now, especially. So I come to this issue having looked at the China development model, both from when I was the head of the Asia Bureau at USAID, when we were negotiating directly with the Chinese, both in individual countries and more globally in terms of China's participation in international forums, but also as the U.S.-China Commission, where we're looking closely into the Belt and Road Initiative and China's involvement in Asia and Myanmar in particular. But the main point that I think we should emphasize that has been mentioned already is that China is pursuing a complex, but it's a coherent strategy that maintains the status quo in terms of division and ethnic conflict. And while Beijing doesn't want conflict to spin out of control in Myanmar, it believes that the current conflicts and the ethnic divisions are in its strategic interest and provides it leverage. And a key fact that we found is that, while China is providing arms to the Tatmadaw, and it's one of the biggest suppliers to Burma's military that's committed abuses, including against the Rohingya, it's also providing arms and political support to the United State Army, which is the largest ethnic group that fights the Tatmadaw. And on page 29 of the report, we really go into that in depth in terms of China's support for the illicit activities and the military activities of the United State Army. And that this isn't a contradiction. It's a strategy to keep the ethnic conflicts going to achieve its strategic interest. And I think that, while China is always going to be involved in Myanmar and always going to have a strong position there, it's important that the government of Myanmar focus on utilizing the United States, using the international community in terms of our involvement, in terms of trying to mitigate the dependence on China. And I think that's a very important finding. And again, China is pursuing a coherent strategy here. It's not a contradictory strategy.
I failed to provide an adequate introduction. Thank you, Jonathan Stivers from the U.S. Economic and Security Review Commission. Does anyone else want to say anything? Do you? All right, we will open the floor for general questions from the audience. Someone will come around and give you a microphone. It's your turn to speak, and please provide your name and affiliation, and if we can, try to keep the questions relatively short, then that'll give us more time to hear from more people. Thank you.
Hi, Hunter Marston from the Brookings Institution. Thank you for the fantastic readout of the report. Sounds good, and I look forward to getting into it at length. My question is a bit big picture, but how does China feel about Myanmar being more of a democracy these days than it was just 5-10 years ago when China enjoyed overwhelming influence in the country? I'm wondering if it has good relations with both civilian and military leadership, and if prospects for true stability mean its influence could be undermined. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I echo my thanks for the wonderful analysis in the report. I'm Mac Darrow from the UN Human Rights Office. I have a question on the development aspects. I'm not sure if I might have read too quickly, but I'm not sure if I saw reference to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in the report. I asked the question because of the well-documented ways in which bad development can actually fuel conflict within and across borders. And multilateral development banks play a particularly important role as sending a signal for investors as well as the financing they provide. And this is a particularly difficult environment for development to happen sustainably. At the same time as the AIIB is consulting on draft information policies and accountability mechanism that look like they might, if they go forward in the current form, undercut existing multilateral development bank standards. So to the extent that transparency and accountability, as was pointed out in remarks, are important, this might be a risk factor that warrants looking at. So I just want to pose that question, as well as the question of the security issues that were examined in the report. My former boss, the Zehrad Al-Hussein, who spoke on these issues here, in fact, several months ago, warned in the northern Rakhine State of the possibility of a regional confessional conflagration if the Rohingya issue is not dealt with well. And so I just want to ask that question as well. Is that something that you analysed in the report and could comment on? Thank you.
Hello. My name is Alison Chen. I am a journalist focused on China's political repression and social movement for 7 years now. I'm a student in the School of Foreign Service of Georgetown University, and I have two questions. The first question is from my reporting experience. There have been increasing cases suggesting the Chinese policeman is directly cooperating. The Myanmar's policeman is directly cooperating with Chinese policemen and allow Chinese policemen to get into the country and take back some of the political prisoners. And these cases happen very fast that it shouldn't be formal. When a political prisoners go into Myanmar for 2 days, and Chinese policemen can directly take him back from Myanmar. So this kind of direct cooperation, is it normal? Have you considered it into your report? And is this change the relationship of China and Myanmar? What is exactly happening? It doesn't look like a country-to-country relationship already. And this is the first question. And the second question is about the recommendation. A lot of the recommendation you talk about is begin with the phrase China should, but how is this institution or the U.S. government can tell China what they should do? I mean, nowadays it seems like China is not really listening. And what if China do not do this kind of thing or keep doing things in his way? What are you suggesting, or what are the U.S. going to do with this kind of situation? Thank you.
Yeah, actually, that's 5 questions.
Yeah,
yeah. 3 good question areas or 5 questions. And try and go through them. And some of them are touch into the issue of the report. And others are a little bit separate, but still, we should answer all of them. China's view of Myanmar's democracy. I think they were stunned when it started to happen. I mean, Dr. Steinberg talked about the "Who lost Myanmar" moment, wherein things started to drift away, and I think the previous government wanted to lean a bit more towards the West, at least to have balance and have options, and maybe have some leverage that way too. Or they appreciated what we're having to offer and our values and such. But China today, I think they're very realist. I mean, I think they feel there's probably a little bit of concern about the demonstration effect along their border when there's a successful democracy, and whether that can then inspire others across the border that democracies can work in Asia and they can be stable in multi-ethnic environments like Myanmar. But I think China privately, what I'd heard is they felt that this was going to take a long time for it to really take hold, that they knew the peace was going to take a long time, that democracy was going to be difficult, that maybe the military was not going to give up. It was going to. So I think they realized as things were moving away from them, strategically, not just in terms of political system, that they were trying to catch up with Dasu and the NLD. And so when she won, they made a major sort of charm offensive. There was a major push to get her to come to Beijing, which she has, I don't know, 5 times now, to reach out to her, to try to, to work on the issue that she cares most about that gets to this issue of peace. I mean, this is right at the top of her list of her legacy issues, because this was a legacy of her father. This is the defining challenge of the country. How do you get peace in a place that hasn't had it since independence? So yes, I think the Chinese figured out how do we get through to her The peace process will help her with that. We'll try to twist the arms of the ethnic armed organizations. So they accommodated to her, even as they, I think, were worried that the democracy thing may mean constitutionally, and just instinctively, that means they will be more oriented towards the West. So, and as we were saying, they've done pretty well, and they're wonderful at taking advantage of opportunities, and the Rakhine State issue, the Rohingya issue, has given them that opportunity to pull back and say, we're the only ones that are backing you. And it's back to where it was 10 years ago, basically, where they're standing up in the UN and blocking resolutions and investing when others are pulling out. So China has a little bit of a complex view, but they're realists, and they'll deal with Myanmar as it is going forward. AIIB issue of standards. This is an important issue and something to watch. Early on, well, first, we were threatened by AIIB, which was foolish, I think. We should try to shape it and be thoughtful about it. And then AIIB, early on, looked like it was just working with the World Bank and was conforming to good standards, reasonable international standards. I haven't followed it, but if it is, as you suggest, that standards are starting to be shaped in more the Chinese direction, the AIIB, that's a real concern. That becomes a competition of norms and rules and standards, which is essentially the competition of the 21st century we see anyway happening under Xi Jinping. I mean, the first time since the Cold War, we're seeing an ideational challenge from major powers towards the U.S. or the Western kind of ideas of openness, transparency, all this kind of, and of democracy. So this should be watched very much and should be of concern if AIB is moving in that direction. We don't deal with it in the report, but the issue of norms and standards and how, the second part of your question, how it gets involved in conflict, it should be watched, absolutely. Regional implications of the Rohingya issue, yes, absolutely. I've always felt this is not just a national issue. It has certainly Bangladesh, and they have their own problem with extremism and terrorist cells. There are issues when the Rohingya were on boats when I was there and going to Thailand and Indonesia and Malaysia. If there's desperation, that's where extremism festers. And it doesn't just stay in one place. You see it happening in the Philippines and elsewhere. So absolutely, this is a regional issue, and it's that I think Myanmar needs to recognize that it's not just an internal affair. Issue of police cooperation. When I was there, that happened. There was a dissident that I knew about it late, I guess. It was too late to try to help in any way. It was just along the border. And Myanmar police, before we knew, gave him back to the Chinese police. Not a whole lot we can do about that. I mean, there are political asylum standards, but not much we can do about it. If Myanmar police feel they don't want to be harboring people and be a safe haven, which can really put you in bad stead in Beijing. So if that continues, it's extremely unfortunate and wrong for a democracy to do that, a country that believes in human rights. Not much we can do. And I guess to your second part, when we say China should, it's because we believe this is in the broader interest of stability, security, for international security, for Myanmar's peace and stability. So all the things that we recommend are for the broader interest. It's not we're doing it because do it for America. We're doing it for Myanmar's peace, Myanmar's stability, regional security. And if they don't do it, then they should answer, frankly, to a broader region or regional interests. If they're not conforming to the best interest of Asia, best interest of Myanmar, best interest of Southeast Asia, then I would hope that others would stand up and speak out about this. And not just the United States, because when it's just the United States, it becomes a great power competition. And that's what we want to avoid. If it's China versus the region and smaller powers, it's norms and standards. And that's where we need to get to.
Can I just say a quick word about the Rohingya crisis? If you wanted to seed the stage for extremism and radicalization, this is really what it would look like, right? I mean, I've seen this on the Bangladesh side. I haven't seen it in Rakhine. How desperate do you need to be to flee to a very poor country, Bangladesh, where you have no property rights, you cannot work, you have trouble getting off the beach, you're living under a plastic flap? I think also about when we think about China's diplomatic and material role in allowing this crisis to continue to unfold. I mean, it's very different, but I think we also think of what China's policies are doing in Xinjiang. And I think this is the problem with the nature of the Chinese decision-making system under one party and one man rule, is that actually it is not in China's self-interest for the kind of regional crisis you are seeing out of the Rohingya crisis, just like it's not in China's interest to have its Western population ever more resentful of rule from Beijing. So I think it's an example of sometimes strategists and experts paint China as pursuing this very sophisticated grand design to remake world order. And in fact, it looks, I think, to me like these are strategic errors, right? And the neighbors are watching, and I think other groups in Myanmar are also watching. I mean, there are many more experts than me here on Myanmar's internal politics. But if you wanted to create a scenario for ethnic reconciliation among all the groups in Myanmar, you would not allow the Rohingya crisis to unfold in the calamitous way that it has, because other groups will note that. And there will not be positive effects on reconciliation more broadly. I mean, the Rohingya crisis, I don't think, can be compartmentalized, right?
Thank you. Congratulations. You guys have made a terrific presentation today. Is it working? Now is it working? Okay. Thank you very much for a terrific presentation, all of you. It's really wonderful. And I particularly like David Steinberg's idiosyncratic view of history, and I would like to associate myself with it. But there's another aspect here that I think is missing, but it comes up in some of these questions. Illiberal democracy. Right now, the world is sort of caught in a cold war between liberal and illiberal democracy. Illiberal having a wide spectrum, but going all the way from bad governance to dictatorship. And illiberal leaders, the leaders of illiberal democracies, tend to see liberal democracy as an existential threat to the cohesion of their societies. And it is indeed a very messy form of government, as we know well. And so when we talk about China's fear of U.S. presence in Burma, it's not a fear of a military presence, it's a fear of a political presence, and that becoming a backdoor to influence internal political events in China. That's a big problem in China, and that has come out in my discussions with Chinese about Myanmar very strongly. Secondly, the development of a liberal democratic strain, which represented by the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi in Burma, was a great fear, as you noted, to China. So when they saw it moving towards democracy in that particular form, they wanted an Asian form of democracy, not liberal democracy. So they have been able to, because of the embattlement of the NLD government, they've been able to form a very strong relationship with them, hoping to draw them in the direction of illiberal democracy, I would say. And that's something that we need to think about. It's very important for us to be supporting the proponents of liberal democracy in the country, no matter how bad the conditions, and not shutting ourselves off from that, because there's a struggle going on there. It's not a U.S.-China thing. It's a struggle in sort of political thinking, political ethic, and that's something that we need to be concerned about. And I'd be interested in whether, well, particularly David and Derek, whether you agree with that.
A lot more hands now. We'll start.
Thanks very much. Fascinating report, so thank you very much for that. I'm Miwa Hirono I'm a Fulbright Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. My question is, to what extent is the widespread question about China's motive you mentioned, which is China is not interested in hot war nor complete peace, an actual deliberate policy by the Chinese government? The reason I say this is related to another question of who is China. And you mentioned that there is a wide range of Chinese actors working, and the Chinese government is really finding it hard to control them. And I think that's absolutely true. And the evidence that is oftentimes reported, I haven't read your report, so I don't know about that, but oftentimes reported is that arms provision to conflicting parties is done by the Chinese, but it's done by the Chinese companies. There's another Chinese element coming in that is not necessarily controlled by the Chinese government. So my question is, what is the evidence that the Chinese government deliberately wants Myanmar to be neither a hot war nor complete peace? The big question to leave you with is that what's the difference between non-interference, as you mentioned, and influence? And I think that might have a good implication for the broader debate. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Edmund Downey. I just finished a Fulbright scholarship at Yunnan University in Southwest China, looking at Chinese investment and economic engagement with Southeast Asia in the agriculture and energy sectors. My question is somewhat similar to hers, but a kind of flip side about varied interest within the Myanmar state. So what are the different thoughts on relations, what kind of relationship Myanmar should have with China that come out of the army, civilian sectors, business community, party players? That's a lot. Choose what you want, choose what matters. But I'd like to hear about that different political landscape in Myanmar and the different visions of how to relate with China that come out of that.
Thank you. Paul Donowitz, I oversee Global Witness's work in Myanmar. Following on Allison's comment, seems the recommendations are very China should, transparency, CSR. Looking at U.S. foreign policy and U.S. policy right now, driven by the administration and Congress and maybe what they do or they don't do, if you could potentially talk about ways that the U.S. government should be modifying its current policy with regard to China, Myanmar, China, would be helpful. And I just wanted to also make a plug, because I know that the ambassador is here today. I think it's important that we raise the issue of the Reuters journalists and the crackdown on civil society. I think it's important to continue to focus on those issues as well.
Those are very, very difficult questions, good questions. Well, I agree with you, Priscilla. I think that's a very interesting point. And it's another side of my sort of thinking about this norms and standards and whether it's political tug of war of what type of political system. But I agree with you. I think Myanmar is somewhat of a challenge to it, and it's sort of soft underbelly and viewed as potential threat by Western influence that can work its way through the Southwest. I mean, China thinks in terms of encirclement and containment and of a sphere of influence and the need for ensuring that they have a buffer of some kind. So I don't think anything that you've said, I think it's a really fascinating way of putting it and not a way I've thought about, but something I'll think about more. And maybe others here will have thought on that illiberal versus liberal democracy perspective. But I'll move away from that because I associate myself with your thinking. This issue of what evidence we have of a hot war, of them wanting neither hot war nor complete peace, and then the issue of who is China. How do you assess who wants what there? That's a difficult one. That's actually a very difficult thing to, but we went by in some way scholars here who have looked at this very, very closely and talked to people in Yunnan who are specialists, folks in Beijing, and that was the assessment of a very leading scholar, I think Yun Sun, I could say, that's her assessment of how China views the situation there. And we matched that up to how China's engaging and the incentives, the leverage they do have now. and made a judgment that it seems that China gets a great value not out of having a terrible hot war, but that if there were complete peace, there would be a situation there that would be a little less to their strategic advantage. So it's a judgment we make, but it's from talking to many different actors inside China and those who are talking to the actors inside China of how they view the situation. And in part, I mean, what we would hear is Chinese don't believe that peace is going to come very soon anyway. They're pretty confident that there's not going to be a complete peace very soon, so they can be engaged on this in their way and work as best they can on facilitating peace without worrying about it actually becoming true, a complete peace. Just like 10 years ago, they used to say to the United States, you know what you should do? You should stop isolating China and get rid of your sanctions. And then we engaged engaged Myanmar, and got rid of our sanctions, and China said, you're trying to encircle us. Just when we did exactly what they wanted us to do, to get rid of our sanctions and to engage them, then they said, oh, well, you have an ulterior motive. And my theory on that is China never actually believed that we would get rid of our sanctions and engage Myanmar. But when we actually did, they were stunned, and they had to readjust. So anyway, the evidence is hard, but I think it's pretty compelling by talking to many different actors. Relationship of Myanmar and the Chinese, the Chinese state? I didn't write that down right. With the Chinese state.
How do different players in Myanmar see the relationship?
Yeah. What kind of relationship do different players in Myanmar want? With China, how does that differ among the players?
There are an infinite number of different players. The ethnics have they want China to back them up and do business. The central government wants them to block access for whether arms, material, money to the ethnics. Businessmen just want to do business any way they can. There's an infinite number of interests, but get what you can from the big power, both political and economic power that they have. So that's a very long kind of discussion to have, and we don't have much time. How should the U.S. modify its policy towards Myanmar or China and Myanmar? I think that's a really huge question. I'm not sure where you start on the policy side, to be honest. We should coordinate. Stick with Myanmar, certainly, but it's complicated when you get to how do we modify our policy. There's a lot there. We have to get very specific on modify what, for what purpose. We have to stay true to our principles. We have to stay true to the absolute tragedy going on and not forget about it, and focus on those human beings that are without any kind of dignity or anything right now, no identity. But also there are other people in the country that have suffered greatly, and we should stay true to them too. How you balance those two is a very difficult challenge.
On the USG policy question, I think there's one overarching consideration that the government in Naypyidaw will need to factor in, which is that Congress in the United States for so many years was a champion of this relationship and of Burma's democratic promise and potential. And if the goal of the government in Myanmar is to achieve the kind of balance Professor Steinberg outlined, that's going to get a lot harder without congressional champions. And let's be honest, the mood in Congress is much harder on this country as a result of the journalists' imprisonment, as a result of the Rohingya crisis, as a result of the dashed hopes for democracy in Myanmar that so many members of Congress, including very prominent ones like Mitch McConnell and John McCain, supported Aung San Suu Kyi on for so many years. And I think this is going to make it much harder for the Myanmar government to achieve balance.
Final word, I guess, on the issue of the Reuters reporters. I do want to spotlight as well. It is a very unhappy situation, and we should not forget about anything going on there. But we do have to put it all in context. But that particular issue shows a regression that's very unfortunate.
Yes, a few comments. I think when we talk about China, it's like talking about Washington. There are lots of different elements. And one of the critical elements is Yunnan compared to Beijing. And we know in the past that there have been differences, sometimes constructive, sometimes not. For example, they say that the pipeline, the oil or gas pipeline, oil pipeline from the Middle East through Myanmar was an idea from Yunnan University. It was not from Beijing, but it obviously was in Beijing's interest. The 2009 Kokang uprising was supposedly was not predicted or by the Yunnan government, which caused Beijing to send the PLA to take over some of the functions that Yunnan did before, because they didn't trust Yunnan. Yunnan's position has been sometimes, as they say, if Beijing says we can't do it, then we can do it. But that may not always be true. But that creates some sorts of tensions. And if you go to Naypyidaw, you'll see innumerable delegations from Yunnan coming in to talk about various policies. So there is this particular question on China. There is, I argue, a kind of Chinese arrogance towards Myanmar. We have our own form of arrogance because we are a great power. China's form of arrogance goes back to a dependency, a sphere of influence that still, I think, affects some sorts of Chinese attitudes towards Myanmar and Southeast Asia in general, but Myanmar specifically. I think this plays a role, and Chinese have overplayed their hand. I mean, Chinese influence was exceedingly important. According to the Burmese sources, 2/3 of all Burmese military trained abroad were trained in China. The provision of equipment and so forth has been very, very important. Whether that equipment was of the standard that the Burmese wanted is another matter. One can argue about that. But I think we have to understand that Burma is always concerned about China. And let's say it's not Pakpo, it's fear. It's fear starting with the takeover of the PRC, actually, in the Chinese Revolution. Burma watched that very, very carefully and was very fearful of it. And the U.S., in fact, let them down on this question of the Kuomintang troops in Burma in 1949, 50, and thereafter until about 1960. There are many issues that people have raised. I can't go into them now. I think that the U.S. policy has been, the previous influence of Aung San Suu Kyi has been so important, and on both the Republicans and the Democratic side. This is a bipartisan thing, although Mitch McConnell was the most avid advocate of her in the Congress, I believe. But the fall from grace, if you will, that is taking place is tragic, well, except for her, but for the country itself, because it does have an impact on the U.S. role. It has an impact on investment. It has an impact on tourism. It has an impact on all kinds of attitudes towards that country. Many influential people that one talked to before said, I wouldn't go to Burma because Aung San Suu Kyi is under house arrest. Until that's resolved, I refuse to go. But now we're seeing a problem again. Should we go? Should we? What is our attitude towards this country? And this is a severe problem for the government, and I'm afraid the government has avoided the issue, Aung San Suu Kyi specifically, and this is going to cause problems for our relations with Myanmar and for our relations with Aung San Suu Kyi too.
Great. Okay. Yes, Master.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to pose any questions to you, but to say a few words. First of all, I thank the USIP for organizing this event, and also as a representative of Myanmar, I come here to show how interested we are in listening to the concerns of the stakeholders in the United States, especially the democratic institutions, how you see us with regard to our relationship with China. this will also be very useful for not only for the government, but also for other stakeholders in assessing what we will need to do in respect of our relationship with China. So Myanmar is a very young democracy. United States has helped us a lot in the past to reach this position. We are grateful to this people of the United States and the government of the United States. And as a young democracy that is on the course of nation building, please do continue to support us. We have many issues, and Dr. Steinberg has re-pointed the complexities of the issues, the problems in our country, not only the problems in our country, but also the problems that we have, the complexities between our relationship with China. So since you all are the scholars of Myanmar, you know how complex the situation is. But we are dedicated to resolve all the difficulties with your support, and we are doing in good faith. Yes, the recommendations that contained in the report is very valid for us. With regard to the recommendations that the report has made on the advisory commission's recommendations, we are taking seriously on these issues. And also the situation in Rakhine State, and also with regard to the sentencing of 2 reporters, we are serious on it. Maybe one day a time will come when this Official Secrets Act will be eliminated, and also reporters will be able to obtain the classified documents as you have in the United States or other Western countries. And also reporters will be able to get information on the military operations like you have in the Western world. Since this is a very young democracy, please understand our situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you all for joining us today. This has been a great discussion, some wonderful questions, and I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone. I want to thank our 2 wonderful co-chairs, again, Dan and Derek, for leading this effort. Thank you to Dr. Steinberg for his remarks. Thank you to all of the SSG members for all of your work on this project over the last several months. To all of the experts here in Myanmar and other places around the world who did late-night Skype calls and other fact-checking with us, we thank you for your support. And really, this has been a great project, and we're really proud to put this report out today. So please take a hard copy when you leave. For those of you watching online, you can find a soft copy of the report and the executive summary on the USIP website. But thank you again for joining us today, and we look forward to carrying this tradition forward in our next SSG report in early 2019. Thanks again.